So hello, and thank you for joining our lunchtime webinar, The Blue, Brown, and Green, an innovative approach to looking at our rivers. I am your host, Abby Burk, the Western Rivers Outreach Specialist for Audubon Rockies, a regional office of the National Audubon Society. Let's get right to it since we have lots to present to you today. Chris, go ahead and advance one slide, please.
There you go.
Your phone lines, thank you very much. Your phone lines have been muted since we have a large number of participants today. We will be accepting questions after the main presentation of today's webinar. When you have a question, please use the chat feature on your screen to type your messages or questions directly to me. So thanks again for joining, and I'd like to introduce our presenter today. So Chris, go ahead and advance one more.
There we go.
Great, thank you. All right, so it's my great pleasure to introduce friend and colleague, Dr. Chris Rasmussen. Growing up at a creek in her backyard, Dr. Rasmussen has long been a fan of all things river. She has made a career out of studying rivers from the perspective of the disciplines of botany and zoology, range management, and fluvial geomorphology. With extensive experience in GIS, fisheries, and endangered species conservation. As the owner of Eco Mainstream Contracting in Mancos, Colorado, she has worked with a variety of agencies, conservation organizations, and researchers around the West, classifying and diagnosing river issues and working with community groups toward cooperative solutions. Her current endeavors are to bring people and rivers together with greater understanding and benefit to both. So, Dr. Rasmussen, when you're ready, it's my pleasure. Thank you so much for your time today. Take it away.
Okay, excellent. Well, thank you, everyone, for joining us, and hopefully you're enjoying your winter afternoon. We didn't have to travel anywhere to get here, which is fabulous. And it's kind of fun. I'm going to have to tone down my arm waving, typical style in presenting, but that's all good and helpful. And huge thanks for Abby for getting this together, all the setup, the organizing, the infrastructure, the technology, and just a huge amount of effort. So thank you, Abby, for all that. So what I'm going to show you today is essentially a summary of how I see rivers, how I've come to understand them after grundle years of school and a bunch of time working around the West. And as we go through here, I'm going to ask for your input. This is, the way of thinking that I'm presenting here is a work in progress. So I've been presenting it to different groups at different times over the last 6 months or so. But if you have suggestions, thoughts, comments, I would love to hear them. And so my email will be available at the end of the presentation. So if you have an opportunity, I'd love to hear what your thoughts are. So with the summary of how I see basic river functions, especially as our world is changing, I'm hoping this will be a little different way of looking at rivers rather than as a single entity, more as a sum of the parts and how it changes. So to do all that, what I'm going to start with is a basic introduction to the physical form and functions of rivers as I see them. And I'll talk about these river processes that create and destroy habitats that the species that we know and love depend on. Also, I'll walk you through some of the climate change projections of what we may be seeing and some of what we're already seeing in precipitation patterns and temperatures and whatnot. And also how the restoration industry is changing and how it thinks and based on what all is happening in our world. I'll present a few case studies of some of our southwestern rivers that I've worked with and then wrap up with some final thoughts. So the basic brown, green, and blue, blue, green, and brown, they're all three there depending on the order. But the way I'm thinking of them is as three co-equal components, essentially a three-way tug of war. And you can imagine three burly guys or three teams on all the different poles, and they will pull them in one direction. For example, a flood will pull it to the water pole, and a landslide may pull it to the sediment pole. So the balance of these three co-equal components is always changing. And you can imagine that point at the middle where those three pieces meet, that's always moving based on the fluctuations in these three different forces. The poles are more simple, the center is more diverse. And the interplay, as all these things are fluxing, create the channels, the floodplains, the habitats for fish and wildlife and the things we depend on. So I'm going to go through these different poles and explain to you what it is I'm thinking and what it is I see. Vegetation is, what's different about this model is I actually put vegetation as an independent player. Often we think of vegetation as the frosting, and sometimes I'm arguing it's also the cake, and it can be the dominant force in a river system and a riparian system. And the primary ways that vegetation exerts its force, now I'm going to anthropomorphize a little bit. I'm going to put human attributes on these different processes just because it's an easier way to think about it. But the agenda of vegetation is essentially slowing water and holding soil, and it does this in a variety of ways. With the roots, they anchor down into the soil, they hold it tight. Roughness, it's whether it's stems or trunks of trees or just the blades of grass, they provide roughness that slow water. Now, wood is a pretty unique thing where it does both. It actually holds soil and it also provides roughness, and it's clearly vegetation, though sometimes it can function a bit like substrate also. So it's a bit of an odd thing, but it's still within the vegetation realm. So to imagine what a vegetation pole is like when it's really, really dominated by vegetation, think Yoda's swamp, where you have a lot of vegetation above, you have a lot of vegetation below, the roots are all intertwined in the soil, and very, very little motion of water through the system. And if it is, it's puddled, it's slow, and very, very little movement of sediment through the system. Also, just because it has to come through water pushing it around. If the water isn't moving, neither is the sediment. So above, below, around, on top, within, very dominated. Now you can see this in meadow systems where it's mostly herbaceous. When in systems like this, you'll see often a flood will come through, and other than things laid over, you won't know that anything ever really happened. It may be with shrubs. This is a photo from Calf Creek near Escalante, Utah, very heavily dominated with shrubs, lots of roughness, lots of roots holding the floodplain together. And you can also see it with wood. This is a fish project in the Pacific Northwest just outside of Gold Beach, Oregon. But same idea, lots of energy dissipation, holding up sediment, lots of roughness. So thinking about the other pole, this is sediment, this is brown, and kind of an unsung portion. Vegetation we usually think of as kind of passive, kind of the frosting, and sediment we kind of don't think of very often. But it also has its own mode. It also has its own agenda, and mostly it is to fill in channels and to also stay in place. And it does this through two different mechanisms. One is by sheer volume, just way more than the stream can move. There may be enough water to push it, it just can't push it all at once. So by just sheer volume and also size. And as a stream is increasingly dominated by sediment, the channel will fill in with stuff that the channel can't move. Then the channel has to move sideways. So a lot of lateral movement side to side. So for the sediment pole, think dune. Think very little water, no vegetation, very mobile sediments moving pretty much at whim. And this is Armenta Canyon, which is just south of Farmington, New Mexico, where maybe not quite as hostile as dune, but probably not far from it either. A lot of mobility. You can see evidence of in one flow, the channel may be here, and another flow, the main channel may be here. It can change at any time and with any flow. And here's another example. This is not sand and fines. This is more gravel. This is in the Pacific Northwest, again near Gold Beach in, I think, Crystal River. But again, just the channel is choked. The floodplain is very much dominated by sediment. So again, that's volume, just so much there to move for the channel. And this is size. This is a friend of mine, Harry, in the South Coast, where you can have a really big flow and it still won't move. So now thinking about this third pole with water, this is the one we're a little more familiar with and a little better. Floods happen and they tend to get people's attention. So the agenda of water is to move everything, pick it up and send it on downhill. and or it can deprive it of oxygen and light, and essentially through depth and through some of the chemistry, eliminate vegetation through depth. Scour is the primary that we think of when we think of how rivers function and how these things play out in the system, but both happen, and I'll show you examples of these. So think flume. Think this is the outflow for Lake Powell, and it's just intensely powerful, intensely scouring, and nothing in those pipes. So that is the most extreme example I could think of for scour. And as a physical example, this is Yellowstone Canyon, where you don't see any green, you don't see any sandbars. Essentially, this river is moving everything it can and creating a deeper and deeper slot into this mountain. Another way this happens is with depth. This is in the Upper Rio Grande watershed in Colorado, where this is a beaver dam. And through depth, it eliminates, you can see the margins of where the vegetation can grow, and that will eventually, over time, as more sediment comes in, that will get shallower, and the veg will be able to grow and persist. But for a while, the water can keep it excluded. So, and in many places that we see, all three are present, but none are dominated. This is the Upper Rio Grande again. You can see the vegetation is present. You can see exposed sediment. You see water. This is in the late season, so it's low channel, but it's there. So all three are there. This lower right hand is in the Arkansas, down the lower basin. Well, not lower Arkansas, but at least before it exits Colorado. And then up in the Pacific Northwest, where you see all three elements. You see sediment, you see water, and you see vegetation. So the question is, okay, so we've got the three poles, we have the three agendas, we have the three modes of operating. The question is, which one is in control and why? And again, that where they meet is always changing. The question is, when does it change, and how much does it change, and why does it change? Now, as going back to our metaphor of the tug of war, these things will pulse and then they will relax. But the question is, how long of a pulse, how strong of a pulse, and how long of a pulse can they maintain it? And with the water system, again, back to the idea of floods. It may be hours, it may be weeks. And in Durango, we had some pretty high water here for quite some time in May. The rain just kept coming. We'll get into that in a few minutes. So hours to weeks. Sediment may be years to decades. Again, if you think of a landslide that comes down a side basin and it hits the main stem, you can almost think of it like a peg in a python. It takes some time to move through. And so if you're standing on the bank and you're watching the sediment pulse move by, it may take 15 years in a place with a lot of water movement. And they've done some work with this in the Pacific Northwest. Vegetation may be months to millennia. Some of these floodplain systems or these high mountain meadow systems, they might have been vegetation dominated for millennia, for thousands of years. And we've documented some of this work in Australia and even here in North America. So the time frames of how long those pulses happen and what happens when they relax is something to think about. So with this brown, green, and blue model, we can use it in a couple of different ways. This is change in space. And again, this is tributary to Reagan Lake up in the Rio Grande headwaters. I was delighted to see this example that changes so quickly. So first point is this muddy mess where you can imagine you get a little rain event. Well, this main little thread of water could just as easily be over here. It could just as easily be somewhere else. There's really nothing to maintain it in space. And so that's over in the sediment pole, down here where this red blob is. Now, if you look just upstream of that, watch this little space. In the next slide, I'll zoom in a little bit on it. This is the head cut. This is where you can see this rim wall where the water is coming from a dip, an elevation change, and it's eroding back. So right at the base of this is a little pool, and it's essentially eroding backwards through this little meadow system. And so this little space right here is where water is the most dominant. And if you look just upstream of that, this spot, where if you walk across it, and I did, your feet get wet all the way across. So this is vegetation dominated, and you don't see exposed sediments and no defined channel either. So very much vegetation in control in that small space. We can also look at changes in time, which is essentially monitoring. We're looking at the same space over a course of decades in this case to see what all is going on. This is in the Colorado River, just downstream of the border with Colorado and Utah. So what I'm going to show you here is, this is a photo from the 1950s, 1953. These are all summer low flow shots. But you can see that the channel is here. You can see the vegetation. There's a little clump of trees here in this red oval, and a little bit of shrubbery and whatnot here. But lots more sediment than vegetation in this little oval. But then you fast forward to 1979. And this is an infrared photo, so the vegetation is showing up pink, and thankfully the blue is water, and then the sediment is gray. But you can see the proportion has shifted significantly. And then fast forwarding again to 2010, and you'll see the vegetation has increased even more, and the sediment has decreased even more, and moving up into here. So we can watch one spot over time, or we can watch different spots over space, and see these same processes emerging. So as things change, as you go from one where things are dominated by one pole or increasingly dominated by another pole, these are some of the processes that we see. So in some cases, you'll see where there's been a variety of an accumulated sediment over years, sometimes thousands of years, and something changes. In this case, you'll see, again, this head cut, where the water is now in charge, and it is eroding back, unzipping, and mobilizing a bunch of sediment. That's one case. And another, this one is where it's moving from vegetation to water, and notice these guys. These are clumps of willows that have, this is an active beaver dam. As the water elevation comes up, then these willow patches have died. They can't take their feet being that wet. And notice these guys also. Some of these tall trees have been drowned, essentially. Now, moving to a sediment domination is, that can be pretty impressive. So this is the Rio Blanco in San Marcos. This is a flood they had this season, where typical flood stage is at 13 feet. At 31 feet, it floods homes. And this one peaked at 43 feet, and you can see this red circle back here. That was debris scar, so you can see how high that water got. So this is at the bridge in San Marcos, and you turn and look the other way, and that's what it looks like. So you can see the amount of floodplain vegetation that has been flushed through, and essentially this sediment has been deposited and placed in this floodplain. A lot of the green stuff got scoured right out. So, and if you're looking at bank erosion, so again, sediment fills in those channels. It fills in the hollow spots, and in places deep it wants to fill up. When that happens, the channel has to move sideways. So often, when we see something like this, when we're working with streams, we're thinking about what the water is doing, when we actually need to be paying attention to what the sediment is doing. Because this sort of side cutting is natural, but often it threatens homes and infrastructure, and sometimes it's frankly too much. It's out of balance. So if you see your stream doing this, then you need to think about what the sediment is doing. Look upstream. So in terms of when vegetation becomes more dominant, that can happen through a variety of different ways. We'll talk a little bit more about going from sediment to vegetation rather than water to vegetation, just as it's, this is a little more familiar, sediment going to vegetation, and I'll show you why. So this is, again, Pacific Northwest. These are Harry's toes. He's a friend of mine back in southwestern Oregon. And so this is a cobble bar, fresh scour. You see seedling alders, seedling willows, and seedling grasses, all throwing elbows and ready to dominate this bar. I think this might even be a little rush. There's a lot of those in that system, where they're actively competing to see who gets to dominate that. And this is the rest of Harry right here. So this is, again, in the Pacific Northwest, where you have these big trees that tend to align themselves in a way, not always, but often, with an upstream root wad here, which will scour a pool, and then the flow slows down back here on the rest of the length of the log, and so these sediments drop out, and they become pretty hospitable places for germination. You have finer grains, better water holding, and protection from flows. So these nodes become vegetated, the vegetation grows and moves outwards, and that's the mechanism for actually recreating a forested floodplain. Another way that happens, which is less than desirable, this is Canyon de Chelly down in Arizona, and the photo thanks to Lindsay Reynolds up in USGS. She did her doctoral research down in here. But this is all this gray-green. This is all Russian olive, and not something you want to see take over your floodplain. This is a line of cottonwoods move through. So in this case, a very well-adapted, aggressive species has taken over the floodplain space. And another way we can see this happen, this is the Dolores River, just right here in my backyard, where the reservoir went in '86, and now we have much fewer and much gentler high flows, and so the vegetation is not scoured out. So now now these are mostly native species. There have been several groups in there doing tamarisk removal work. So these are aggressive natives who are narrowing and simplifying this channel based on the lack of flows. And Dolores is one of those case studies we'll talk about in a few minutes. So changing gears a little bit, we're going to zoom out and talk about climate. So with that background of what water is doing, what vegetation is doing, and what sediment is doing, now we're going to look at the drivers of those three components. So for the Upper Colorado Basin, what we're looking for in general is hotter and drier, and I think you can say that for a lot of places in the world with climate shift. So what we're looking at in a little better more specific terms for the Upper Colorado is more rain in the spring and the summer and the fall, which is actually good news for farmers. Hopefully they'll back off the irrigation needs a little bit, and less snow. The downside of that is as the precip falls in warmer seasons, it's more likely to evaporate or evapotranspire, which can translate to less stream flow. So a couple sides to that. We're looking at longer, deeper droughts. Arizona knows this, so does New Mexico, and especially California with how water is being more challenged. Dust on snow, I like to call that when Arizona comes to visit, where we have these large red dust clouds that come over in four corners and turn our mountains pink, and you can see the pink snowbanks all over the place. In an average year with European-style land management, we're already about 3 weeks earlier on our snowmelt. In really bad, dry, windy years where we have pretty intense dust on snow events, it can be upwards to 6 weeks earlier, and they're predicting that to increase also. One phrase that I've learned here recently working with Mountain Studies Institute on some of this climate change planning is the term feast and famine, and that is essentially what we're looking at with our precip. Is there will be times when we just don't have much, and other times that we get a lot, and that's a violent precipitation. We've been seeing some of that with the St. Vrain up by Boulder, the Rio Blanco in Texas, and here in this Four Corners area, one water manager here locally called it Miracle May, where they were looking at water shortages for the irrigators, and it just didn't stop raining for most of May. It broke records. So we're looking at some interesting shifts. Now, non-stationarity, that's one of those two-bit words that I learned here a couple of years ago that's pretty amazing. Stationarity is assuming that things are going to function like they used to in perpetuity. So it's essentially driving forward, looking in the rearview mirror, which can be, it has served us very well. Stationarity is, for example, if you're going to buy a house and you have to get a 30-year mortgage on the house, the underwriter of the loan wants to know where you are relative to the 100-year floodplain. What are your odds of getting flooded? In St. Vrain, okay, back up one step. So those 100-year floodplains are based on when it has flooded, how often it has flooded, where it has flooded over the course of recorded history for that basin. In St. Vrain, up near Boulder, when that river went, and they did a post-mortem, essentially, how high did it get, how much did it carry, they found that basin flooded 5 times the 100-year floodplain. That's non-stationarity. We don't know how to plan for that. And a similar thing happened on the Rio Blanco in Texas, and like I mentioned, the Miracle May, and also in South Carolina this summer. They had some pretty spectacular events. Now, this photo that I'm showing you here, this is Wolf Creek Pass. This is the ski resort over here. You can just see a hint of it. But this is beetle kill as it's moving in. So keep this picture in mind as we talk about the next slide. So related to the precip is, okay, what does that mean for what's happening on the ground? Essentially larger and hotter forest fires, tree diseases and predators, that last slide. As the winters are warmer, it kills fewer beetles. And so they start the next season with a greater population. They can move farther and they can move faster. There are some species that if they could cheer for climate change, they would do it. Some of our non-native and aggressive species, they will have many opportunities to expand their range, either through ground disturbance or drought. Wet years, they can take off quicker than our natives sometimes, newly scoured areas and stream deposits. And that's going to be something that we've all got to keep an eye on as we move forward. Infrastructure risks, these are huge. With the flood on the Rio Blanco, they lost a number of large highway structures. And in the floods in South Carolina, they lost upwards to 36 dams in one state, in one area, in one event. So these, we need to be thinking about our communities and our rivers as we move forward into changing times. And lots of damage has been done in the name of flood control. So just one of those things to kind of keep eyes on. So changing industry, I've been working with folks with rivers and their people for 25 years now, typically, and I used to call myself a restoration ecologist, and that term is causing me some concerns now. Restoration is backwards looking. It's trying to restore, same as on your computer software. You go back to a point in time and mimic that. Problem is, where we are now, we can't go backwards. Both for climate change and for population growth, we need to be thinking about our river systems differently. So where we're going, where the industry is going in terms of kind of guiding principles is resilience thinking. Now, 2 terms that I'm kind of folding into this, at least for the purposes of the conversation today and some of the language that I'm seeing. Resistance is essentially strength. How well can a system withstand a disturbance? How well can it hold together with a big drought or hold together with a big flood? Resilience is ability to recover from a disturbance. So part of resilience is resistance, but they are different terms. So just kind of be aware of that as you hear these fly around, that I'm kind of grouping them under one term when there's some divisions within that. But resilience thinking as a whole is a much better foundation for planning going forward than restoration is. Looking backwards, we need to be looking at the windshield, not the rearview mirror. So what does this mean, this increasing resilience? What does it look like, and resistance? And I presented parts of this to a group, Trout Unlimited, where they said, well, what do we do? How do we manage this? What does this look like? And essentially, resilience and resistance is often messy. Think messy, think channel complexity, think a lot of diversity in both the channel boundaries, what bed elements are there, grains, large wood of various sizes. This is a photo from the west fork of the Dolores up here in the base of the San Juans, in the mid-basin of San Juans. For example, you see old trees here where all their branches are knocked off, and you see them degrading, and they're still catching sediment and doing what they do. But here's a brand new tree that just went down. So all of that supposes that you have a constant supply of things coming in. You can see the difference between finer grains here versus larger grains here, that kind of diversity. Here's some smaller grains here. You see pools and riffles. You see different sediment wedges and steps where the water is spilling over. The channel boundary is narrow here it's wider here. So that kind of diversity, anytime it has to change gears, anytime it has to go over something or get wider or get narrower, the river slows down. So this is all about how to help dissipate stream energy and create turbulence. So with resilience, think diversity. Think we have, in this case, this is in the upper Mancus, where we have shrubs, we have young conifer trees, we have mature deciduous trees, we have young deciduous trees, we have mature conifer trees. So think in terms of diverse vegetation types and also age classes, where it's reforming and it's supporting germination in a fairly consistent way. This is a pretty woody system, but don't forget the herbaceous covering. Now, sometimes your systems are only herbaceous, and that's what they do. So in terms of geomorphology, resilience, again, looks like diversity, but in a little different way. So we have off-channel and secondary channel habitats, whereas this is again in the upper Dolores, where you've got these long and winding secondary channels, some very diverse habitats, pools and sediment wedges. These are really good at catching flood flow, slowing flood flow, and slowing water. Beaver dams, I'd be shocked if some of these areas down here weren't because of some rather substantial beaver dams. They're really good at storing water and slowing water, and thankfully wet riparian zones don't burn very well. Some of these areas are going to be a little more prone to wildfire. In resilient communities, as I mentioned in South Carolina, they lost a bunch of dams. We also have bridges, water supplies, and how many cities are built in floodplains. So it just makes that much more important looking at our vulnerabilities in terms of our cities and our rivers. Drought-tolerant industries, it's not a matter of you have to be building this or you have to be planting that. It's building an insurance. If you have crops that are just inherently less water demanding, you just have a little more room to maneuver. It's building in some flexibility. Vegetation shifts. Now, some of these stand to be pretty huge. For example, down here in the Four Corners region, much of our area is covered in pinyon juniper, and some in the little higher elevations in Ponderosa. Just in the last 10 years, with some of the droughts, we're already losing the pinyon in a lot of these broader expanses. You know, Mesa Verde is covered in pinyon juniper all the way down into Cortez, but it's falling out of the system then pretty quickly. The juniper is hanging on okay. Ponderosa, in a number of places, they're looking at losing range there also. So, and this is over the course of 2 or 3 decades, well within my lifetime, that we'll see some of these changes. And some of that it's tied to fire risk for our urban industry, or our rural boundaries, our developed boundaries, whether or not certain industries can be supported, and certainly our ecosystems. So fire risks interact with all of these different pieces. So let's go into some case studies. I'm going to walk you through 3 different spaces. The Colorado River is a free-flowing stretch as it moves through Utah. The Dolores River downstream of McPhee Reservoir, and that's in Colorado. There's a touch of it in Utah, but I'll be talking more about the upper end. And also the Animas River. It hit the news in a pretty spectacular fashion this last summer. So the Colorado River, it's complicated. So this one is the free-flowing stretch, and the project I had been working on for a while goes from the Colorado border all the way down to Lake Powell. And wow, there's a lot going on this river. Very heavily regulated, many sensitive species, both fish and birds. Politics of 40 million people in 7 states and 2 nations, at least in terms of how the water is managed. Fires, floods, invasive weeds, beetles to eat the invasive weeds, some but not all, industry, recreation, human water use, and climate change. Things are just busy on the Colorado, and it's big. So some of what, some of what has been going on the Colorado, I showed you this slide earlier, but just to highlight it again, just a change in how much sediment there was versus how much sediment is exposed now. And this is why. So in the Colorado, we have artificially low high flows, and the green throws a party. We have artificially high low flows, because this section of the river is essentially a conduit getting water from the high mountains of Colorado and the Rockies to Arizona to California. So it's a conduit, and they move that through in the summertime. It would typically be lower flow. We have intact sediment supplies in this stretch. There are dams, there are big dams, but the big dams are on the tributaries, not on the main stem. So the smaller tribs and even some of the bigger ones, those dams are pretty high even on the tributaries. So intact sediment and truncated flows, which means we're losing side channels. We're losing secondary channels for endangered fish habitat. We're gaining riparian habitat for birds, which is a plus. And this section of the river has had some really dramatic flows in the past 5,000 years or so, quite a few of them. So the driver of this, this graph here, the red line is the actual flow as measured as it goes past the Cisco gauge, which is just downstream of where the Dolores comes into the main stem of the Colorado. This blue line comes from the Bureau of Reclamation, which is a reconstructed flow. What the water would be like, what the flows would be like without the cross-basin, trans-basin diversions that go up and over to Denver and irrigation losses. So that's a pretty substantial difference between what was, what could be, and what actually is. So that's what's driving the loss of channel width and some of the dynamics of brown. So in the Colorado River, there's a number of groups, Park Service, the Nature Conservancy, BLM, and Forestry Fire and State Lands for the state of Utah have all been very active in doing some things on this stretch of the river. They've been fireproofing cottonwood stands, campgrounds and roads, and that typically means removing tamarisk. They're trying to reactivate some backwaters in the town of Moab or in that area, and some others to mitigate and improve some of the fish rearing and spawning habitat for these endangered fish, and also a lot of controlling invasive species such as tamarisk, Russian olive, and knapweed. But notice that these fixes, these treatments have all been about green. They've all been about the vegetation, but the root cause is blue. Okay, so moving on to the lower Dolores. This is an awfully busy river also. So this is just downstream of the town of Dolores, near Cortez. And from the late 1880s, this has been a primary river for agriculture for a long time. In fact, the town of Cortez was kind of a work camp for irrigation tunnels and whatnot for this area. So from the late 1880s, the channel was dried up entirely from spring into October. McPhee was completed and filled in 1986. So now the lower Dolores, below the dam, has summer flows, where for about 100 years it didn't. But it also has much lower high flows, and some years it has none at all. In fact, most years it has none. The irrigators try hard to save enough flow, but they've got to meet needs for fish and for irrigation. And once in a while they have enough rain, enough snowmelt, so they can actually do a release and flush the river a bit, and the rafters are all over that, which is fabulous. The other thing about this diversion system is often, I guess typically, the water will go out of the dam, it will wind around, serve its needs, or serve humans' needs, and then go back to the same river. This one doesn't. It goes up and over the ridge, and it goes down through Cortez, and it goes out to the San Juan. So it doesn't go back to the river. It doesn't go back to Dolores River and down. So a couple of the pieces, a couple of the factors. Dissappointment Creek is it's a large tributary to the upper portion of the lower Dolores River. So it's downstream of McPhee. It's a big basin, and it comes out of the Mancos Shale, which is just some hostile stuff. Lots of heavy metals and poor plant growth. So it's a very flashy stream with some pretty nasty chemistry. And so you can see this is the Dolores River here. This is where it meets Dissappointment Creek. And sometimes even when we have a big flow in Dissappointment Creek, while the Dolores is at low flow, there will actually be fish kills downstream of the confluence just for water quality. It's kind of nasty. So in the photo on the right, you'll see the other big problem on the Dolores, which is invasive species. So this is essentially an understory of Russian knapweed with an overstory of tamarisk, which is kind of yuck. The tamarisk beetles have been awfully active in the basin, and but that's still kind of a question mark on whether the tamarisks are actually dead, whether the beetles are going to maintain. They have good years, they have bad years. So it's an ongoing issue. So to kind of summarize what's going on the lower Dolores, it has a long-term and intensive alterations of flow. So between being dewatered for 100 years and now very truncated high flows, it's just been altered hard. It has a huge accumulation of sediment since 1986 when the dam went in and caught all those flows. It has a lot narrower and simpler channel than it has before. It has a lot of non-native riparian species and some very aggressive native species that are that are closing down the channel. It has many flow-related threats to native fish species, some that are endangered and some that are sensitive. But again, the fixes and the groups who've been working on the Dolores, out of necessity, have been about green and not about blue. And all that is relates directly to what brown is up to or can't do anything if blue's not moving. So pretty common story. Okay, now let's switch gears over on the other side of the San Juans to the Animas River. And this one rolls through Durango. It's a hard-working river where you have no main stem dams. There are two dams, but they're off-channel. There's one very high on the watershed, and there's one down by Durango where they actually pump the water uphill into Lake Nighthorse, which is owned and managed by one of the tribes. So a lot of mining in the headwaters. That's Silverton. Tailings up until the 1930s went straight into the river. It was only after that they decided they better put them into piles and somehow try to reclaim them. So acid mine drainage has been happening for over 130 years. It's been pretty rough. In the mid-reaches around Hermosa to below Durango, it's a lot of farming, a lot of housing in those mid-reaches, a lot of irrigation withdrawals, urban pollution and development. The lower reaches, now this is the one that hits the paper more often here locally, is the nutrient pollution. And they've been chasing that down for quite some time because that's a icky and ongoing and pretty serious problem on the Durango, or in the Animas. A lot of oil and gas development with roads, wastewater, and sediment. Again, a very hard-working river. So the Animas is interesting because it comes out of that high mountain meadow, which is Silverton. It goes through a very slot canyon, tight, amazing canyon, which you can see from the narrow gauge railroad, by the way. It's amazing. And then it opens up wide into this floodplain. So all the sediment, all the stuff that's come rolling down through that tight canyon where it can't land because the water's moving too quickly, it hits this open valley bottom, and look at all the sediment that gets dumped right there. So in this photo, the river is flowing from the top of the photo down to the bottom. So a lot of that gets dumped just after that canyon opens up. Now, which is neat to see the sediment supplies there and intact and moving some channels around. There are some extractive industries in this section. There's some gravel removal and some things that might be cause for concern, but at least some of these processes are intact. Now, just below that, and really nothing that extreme in between, notice it goes very quickly to a single thread, very widely meandering. You can see the old meander scars in here. And so very different in just a short space where the sediment dumps, and then it kind of settles down, and then it moves into this very meandering, pretty amazing little stretch of river. So let's move upstream into, this is Silverton, the town of Silverton, where the spill happened. So you'll notice, okay, this is the Animas River. So no discoloration, it's just kind of an average looking river bottom for that high up. And then the one that goes straight north is the Sediment Creek, and notice the orange color. So this is some Google Earth image taken in August 2011. So that orange coloration, that acid mine drainage has been going on for quite some time. So the spill happened into Sediment Creek, and then it flowed on down to the Animas from Silverton. So the Gold King mine spill, boy, it got some attention. We had 3 million gallons of acid mine drainage and heavy metals and acidic and yuck all in a 2-day time frame. It just gushed. It hit CNN, it hit the Post, it hit the Times. There were some Mountain Studies Institute did some work with parks and wildlife, fisheries biologists testing the fish and aquatic insects, what's going on. Saw it on Al Jazeera, saw it on BBC. I mean, it made international news. The reality of it is, though, it's been going on for an awfully long time. It's been oozing waste for decades. The trick was this got plugged up, and so it got backed up, and all came out in the middle of summer with the rafting industry and the recreational industry, which is really heavy in Durango. But it's been oozing up to 100 million gallons per year for decades. And when you put that in context of the rest of Colorado, we have upwards to 230 mines that are releasing about the same volume, 3 million gallons, every 2 days. So while it got a huge amount of press and it highlighted a problem that really needs to be fixed, which is the old mining law and how we reclaim and what we treat and what we don't, ultimately the Animas is more fixable than other area rivers. It doesn't, if you look at how well brown and green and blue are working and what the big fixes are, they're intact, and it's ultimately more fixable. Okay, so wrapping up with some final thoughts. Some of the big changes are upon us, essentially, with climate change, with human population growth, they're expecting the population of Colorado alone to grow, to double, with I think the 30-year time horizon. Some of the concerns with cottonwood genetics, and there's Tom Whittam down in Arizona has been doing some amazing research. Him and his research crew with NIU, I believe, has been doing some good work on cottonwood genetics. Okay, so if we plant a tree today, or if it's natural germination today, based on what we expect with climate change projections and how hot it might be when we want a mature tree, which is 30, 40, 50 years from now, that tree may not be able to survive based on its genetics, based on its tolerances. And so he's got some really good research going on from down by Yuma, clear up into Canada, with different genetics of not just cottonwoods, but a few other associated species. So this is big. And we focus on cottonwoods just as they're so fun and they're awfully sexy trees. But they're not the only player. They're not the only thing that dominates in controlled systems. But they are an indicator of what we might expect, especially with their long lifespans and when we want them to be functional. Non-stationarity, that fun two-bit term again, is our new normal, or you could even say it's no normal. We don't know what's going to happen. We don't know how things are going to play out. And the thinking, as we're going from restoration thinking to resilience thinking, we also need to be wondering what we're doing in riparian restoration or what we're doing in our riparian river efforts. Are they about the river? Some of them are direct. Yes, we're going to go increase the flow in this place, or we're going to take out these impediments, or we're going to control these weeds. But others are less so. They may be works projects to train teenagers. They may be teaching opportunities with school kids. They may be volunteer efforts where we all just go out and like to think we're making the world a better place. And these are not inconsequential, because these efforts help us to change how we see rivers from a commodity to be used, exploited, extracted, versus something to be nurtured, which is a huge shift, and it's a very, very important one, because if we don't take care of our rivers, they are going to cause us some problems, and we need to be more aware of that. And also within this resilience planning, we need to include our communities, and irrigation, water withdrawal for drinking water, weeds. There's just a bunch of different pieces that the broader communities need to be involved. And to call it what it is, some of these rivers are never going to be what they were, at least for the foreseeable future. With dams, vegetation removal, agricultural use, and some of these other big things that are going on, we're going to have to do a little triage. So a final thought, my hope is that using the brown and green and blue model, we have a framework to at least talk about how some of these changes may hit our rivers, how they may hit our ecosystems, how we can maybe get ahead of those changes, and certainly how we can talk about those changes. And our approach needs to be more about, in a restoration world in the last few years, I've been feeling more and more like we were rearranging deck chairs on the Titanic. This whole thing is a mess. It's all going down, and we're fussing over this little bit and that little bit. When things are getting big enough and the changes are coming fast enough that I think we need to be talking about lifeboats and less about deck chairs. We need to be having very real conversations about saving what we can, where we can, while we can, so that when, and I'm an optimist, I believe that as a society, we will learn that we have to leave more room for rivers, and that when we come to that point, we'll have something to start from. So whether those are intact processes or intact reaches or intact populations of species, whether they're plants or birds or fish, that we kind of hold on to them and help them maintain as well as we can while we can, and have something to start from. And with that, I am happy to entertain questions. And again, as we kind of wrap things up, if you have some thoughts, suggestions, or questions, my email and phone number is at the bottom of the screen, and I would love to hear from you. Abby, it's all yours.
Great. Chris, thank you so much for that great presentation. I've got several questions, and I'm going to kind of triage or try to combine a couple. But I'd like to start off with Tom's question just on one of your final thoughts. And he asked, what might leaving more room for rivers look like in a management situation?
That's an excellent question. It's a topic that we had a conversation about it on the Mancos River, where we're doing a combined ecosystem and community planning effort. And so the agricultural guys are asking the same thing. Okay, what does that mean in reality? So essentially, what we'd be looking at is can we tighten up the water use in such a way that we can, better efficiency, better delivery mechanisms, less waste, so that some stays in the river and it still gets to the ag lands, municipal uses and whatnot. So much of this is what we have known we needed to do for a long time. It's just the intensity. The drivers are stronger. Does that answer the question?
Yeah, I think that's terrific. I know this is certainly something where we're moving towards in our management, and you just put it beautifully, I thought, as well, as far as leaving more room for rivers. Let's go to a question about non-stationarity. Okay, this is from Robert, and he asked, is there a way to manage floodplains in this new normal/non-normal of stationarity? I'm sorry, I'm not quite understanding the question, but it sounds like in light of the large flow fluctuations, can you truly manage riparian habitats and floodplains?
Mm-hmm. Well, and that's one of those things that we have wrestled with. We kind of arbitrarily pick a 100-year floodplain or a 100-year event as our threshold for or we're okay, because it's always been the case with rivers. They're dynamic systems. They're the product of variable events that all come together at the same time. There's always been this mystery of, oh man, we're going to get hammered. So we need to be, in terms of managing floodplains, looking at the non-stationarity, looking at the increased likelihood of violent events. So instead of assuming, all right, it's 100-year, I don't have to worry about it, we may be having to think that may happen every 10 years instead, even if it's just a mental construct for us to put much greater importance on those rare but really extraordinary events. We just need to plan that they may happen. And where, oh, well, this culvert is large enough, we may just think, no, I think we better put in the bigger one.
Absolutely. No, thank you. I'm getting some great questions right now. Let's take Melissa's question here, which I think is right up, certainly my curiosity as well. So Melissa asks how to make vegetation management decisions with the knowledge that a native tree species might not survive in a future climate change. It's a loaded question. Yeah.
And that's what we talked about pretty intensely down in Flagstaff when Tom Whittam was presenting his work. What he's doing, which is amazing, is they're looking at the different genotypes of individual species. And so they're looking at what are the tolerances of individual species to handle, say, a 2-degree change or a 4-degree change or a 6-degree change, and planning to move species north So the ones that are adapted to Santa Fe may be appropriate for up here in the hips of the San Juan. The ones that are here in the San Juan may be appropriate for places up north. So there are really smart people who are devising approaches to exactly that question. Some of the hindrances are, however, when you're talking planting projects or restoration projects, resilience planning projects, I'm going to catch myself on that again, with the federal agencies, they have a mandate that it can only be locally adapted species. Mm-hmm. That's a problem. The way we're looking at things now, we need to have a little more open possibilities. We don't want to be bringing non-natives in from who knows where, but we need to be forward thinking and maybe just doing test plots, trying several different species or several different genotypes of the same species in an area to cover our bases, and planning for flexibility because we just don't know.
That's right. No, well said. I have a similar question from Sue. So I'm sorry, folks, as you're typing questions, I might be taking them out of order so we can kind of keep even like a little bit of a common thread. But Sue asks, could you comment on resilience pressures and or management and how that looks from headwaters to bottomlands? So it's kind of a dovetailed question to what we were just discussing.
Well, and what we're finding in the Animas River effort, which is it's a short little river, but boy, it's got some transition zones that are amazing. When you're looking in lowlands, you're looking at intense flash floods. And when you're looking at highlands, you're looking at potentially decreasing snowpacks. When you're looking at the middle ground, which is where the town of Mancos is, you're looking at decreased flow for ag. You're looking for all these different pieces. So even in one river stretch, as short as this one is, the resilient thinking changes radically from what you're doing up high, which may be protecting beaver dams and improving the forest management so that if you get a fire, it's a mellow fire, not catastrophic. You're looking at where the town intakes are. Are they downstream of a canyon that could just burn and dump all this sediment? So resilient thinking changes a bunch depending on what your reach types are, whether you're going from just snow to rain on snow to just rain to heavy convective storms. So yeah, it shifts.
Definitely, absolutely. Let me look at this one last question. We've just got a few more minutes left, so that's probably our last question. But if you continue to have questions, please feel free to email Dr. Rasmussen, or you can email myself, and we're happy to continue to have these dialogues. But I like Brooke's question very much, and it's certainly something that's near and dear to my heart and what we're doing here with Audubon and our Western Rivers Action Network. The question is, what can the average citizen do to help? Is there anything an individual can do?
Oh, my goodness, absolutely. And Brooke,
yes.
Thank you for the question.
That's right.
So a lot of what I'm trying to do with this messaging is to understand what are the root causes hitting our rivers. So if agriculture that's pulling a lot of the water, if it's municipal waste going into the water, we need to be thinking about where does our water come from? Where does our food come from? Where does our energy come from? Because all these things are primary drivers in how they affect our rivers. And so if we're using lower water demanding crops, if we're eating a little less meat because we're growing a little less alfalfa and we're importing a little less beef, all of these things matter. And if we can do that on a collective basis, then we can actually get somewhere. And honestly, that's part of the reason I've shifted from just doing restoration plans for individual watersheds to I got to talk to people. I got to get this message out because it's only people, it's only individuals that can actually change how we live, because that's what we have to do to change how rivers work and have more room to maneuver.
That's right, absolutely. And as always, I'd love to to toss in, and if you are not already a member of Audubon's Western Rivers Action Network, please you're very much invited to join. It's a great way to stay informed on current and future water issues, webinars, collaborative engagement, everything from policy to on-the-ground riparian work. So I'd love to invite you, to really pitch in and to do the good work, because it does really help you and me and just our entire environment to be active in this restoration and resilience planning, and really telling the story of what kind of rivers we want to take into our future. So that invitation is wide open. So Chris, could you click one more time for me?
Yes, ma'am.
Thank you.
How about that? Okay.
Perfect. And I want to thank Dr. Rasmussen for all of her work in preparing for this webinar and her work on behalf of rivers. Next up, we have another webinar coming up on February 17th, discussing environmental and recreational flows. I will be co-presenting with a good friend and colleague, Nathan Fay from American Whitewater. And I also want you to just put on your calendars for March 9th, a Colorado River 101 with Jennifer Pitt, one of the great all-time Colorado River folks, and will share her knowledge with us about pressures of the Colorado River and basin-wide. So again, lastly, I want to thank you all for sharing your lunch hour with us. We hope you found this information useful. As always, there's much more to come. We hope you join us again and have a great rest of your day. And again, Dr. Rasmussen, thank you again so much.
Okay. Thank you too, Abby, for all your work in this. Keep up the good work.
My pleasure. Thank you all and have a great day.
Thank you.